I'm Athenaeum trustee Deborah Bornheimer, and I welcome you to tonight's lecture by the distinguished British novelist and historian A.N. Wilson. I'm asked to remind you to kindly turn off your cell phones and pagers, and to note that in the event of an emergency, there are emergency exits to my right and to the rear of this room down the corridor. I'm also asked to announce that this event will be available online at the WGBH Forum Network. Our guest tonight, A.N. Wilson, was educated at the Rugby School and at New College, Oxford. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and holds a prominent place in the world of literature and journalism. His biographies, novels, and works of cultural history are informed by vast imaginative scholarship and a flair for eccentricity and ambiguity in human behavior. After the Victorians, his latest work of nonfiction charts in vivid detail the decline of England in the first half of the 20th century, an absorbing portrait that begins with the death of the old queen in the winter twilight of Osborne and ends with the accession of our present queen in a treetop in Africa. The rise and fall of the House of Windsor is but one delicious facet of Mr. Wilson's inspired portraits of warriors, politicians, writers, artists, dreamers, and madmen of this fascinating era. Welcome, A.N. Wilson.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that gracious introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for welcoming me to Boston. I feel a little awestruck standing under this painting, which is a magnificent masterpiece by Benjamin West of King Lear, on the point of becoming totally insane. A state of mind which many of your lecturers, I think, probably understand only too well. I only hope that you've mastered where the exits are, should I follow in King Lear's frenzied path. It's always a great stimulus to visit the United States, unlike Maynard Keynes, the economist, who, when he was coming over a great deal during the Second World War, remarked after a particularly painful encounter with Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary to the US Treasury, "I've seldom struck anything stickier. I always regard a visit to the United States of America as in the nature of serious illness to be followed by convalescence." I've never found that myself, I'm happy to say. But how to condense my thoughts on the first 50 years of the 20th century is indeed a challenge. Such a great challenge that I think it would be impossible for me to do. So what I'm going to do, if you would forgive me, is to offer a few general reflections and meditate upon 4 20th century characters and the manner of their death. So you could call this lecture 4 Deaths, or you could call it, if you were looking for a title which harked back to Kingsley Amis, Down with the 20th Century. First, a few general thoughts about the nature of history itself and historiography. It's been through many changing moods and fashions in the last 100, 200 years. Hegel and his followers believed that history was determined by a mysterious spirit, and such post-Hegelians as Oswald Spengler or Toynbee saw periods of history as unfolding like movements in music. In Spenglerian terms, we see our period, 1901 to 1953, as the time when Britain died and America, as a world power, stepped forward to take its place. In 1901, Britain was the most powerful nation empire in the world, and by 1945, it was ruined. Non-Spenglerians might ask, well, was that an accident? Or was it foreordained by the spirit of time? Or was it, as Keynes might have thought, a hard-nosed decision by the US Treasury? Marxists, who, like Spengler, took their cue from Hegel, have seen fatalistic movements at work in the tea leaves. But their fatalism was economic fatalism. Given certain economic circumstances, societies will be shaped and formed in particular ways. Their costumes, their value systems, their works of art are all the ineluctable consequence of economics, and economics alone. Have the right city-state, the right control of trade by particular guilds and moneylenders, the right social hierarchy, and you will inevitably find yourself with Julius II as Pope and Michelangelo lying on his back painting the Sistine Chapel. Genius or human personality or accident have nothing to do with it. These theories must strike any person of common sense as obvious rubbish. History is not something to be explained, exactly speaking, and insofar as we can discern shapes or patterns in it, the dominating thing is not a mysterious Geist, but human character. It's personalities which shape history, which is why so many of the great historical novels often tell us more about the past than the pontifications of philosophers or historians. And therefore, if I was trying to convey to someone who knew nothing of the period under discussion the flavour of the first 50 years of the 20th century, I think I should concentrate on people and anecdote rather than on theory. And in order to do so, as I said, I'm going to concentrate in particular on 4 deaths. 2 English deaths, one of a German and one of an Indian. The newspaper, or so it seems to me, more than the poem or the novel, is the characteristic production of this period in history. It's the prism through which it distorted the truth. All the great dictators of Europe enjoyed newspapers, either as victims to be suppressed or as vehicles for their own lies. Pravda, the grotesquely misnamed organ of Soviet propaganda, called itself Truth, but it presumably told more lies than any other newspaper ever published, and that is quite an achievement. Mussolini himself was briefly a journalist, a failed journalist, admittedly, as well as, of course, having been a failed teacher. He tried to teach in an infant school, but had to give up because he was unable to keep order. In Britain, towards the end of the Victorian age, the Harmsworth brothers had invented a new sort of journalism. The third Marquis of Salisbury, the Prime Minister at the time, sneered at the first issue of the Daily Mail and said it was a paper written by and for office boys. But Harmsworth felt instinctively in his bones that what came to be known as the century of the common man was about to usher in a radical shift in power. The office boys were no longer to be ignored. At the end of the First World War, my namesake, no relation, H.W. Wilson, a leader writer on that newspaper, the Daily Mail, wrote a remarkable letter to Lord Northcliffe, as the elder of the 2 Harmsworth brothers had become. Northcliffe, or Chief as he preferred to be called, was addressed in this way. As I write, Wilson said, more and more clearly, you appear as the force that won the war. He wasn't writing, you understand, to President Wilson, nor to Lloyd George, but to a man who had spent the previous 5 years shouting down telephones and having very strong opinions. Although Wilson was a sycophant, there is quite a lot to be said for his opinion. Northcliffe terrified the politicians. Gladstone, Disraeli, Rosebery, the earlier politicians in Britain, all had a sly attitude to the press in the Victorian age. And they certainly weren't above using the occasional leak to advance their position or favour their ends. But they weren't in the newspaper's power to anything like the degree that Herbert Asquith was when he became Prime Minister, and of course was Prime Minister at the beginning of the war. When the war was going badly, there is no doubt at all that Northcliffe's decision that Lloyd George should take over the reins of government was very, very influential. And you can't doubt, I think, that Lloyd George's leadership, as well as the intervention of the Americans, another development in which Northcliffe was intimately connected, was decisive in the result of a war which was a military stalemate. The Germans, after all, never lost a single battle in the field during the entire period 1914 to 18. And the extent to which they were believed to have lost the war itself was largely one of perception, until Versailles sealed their terrible fate. Of course, it would be an exaggeration to say that Northcliffe caused the First World War, but even that has something to be said for it. Throughout the 20th century, the power of the press is comparable to the power of poetry and theology in earlier ages. You're never quite sure, when you see the world through its eyes, where fantasy ends and where the truth begins. In 1901, for example, Northcliffe's Daily Mail was the most pro-German English newspaper. It would be impossible, he wrote, or dictated through his newspaper, to find in the records of our history a future sovereign who has so much endeared himself to the British people as has the Kaiser. Of course, Queen Victoria had died in the Kaiser's arms in Osborne House. By 1910, only 9 years later, the paper was serializing a novel called The Invasion of 1910, and advertising the book with sandwich boards carried by men in Prussian uniforms and spiked helmets, goose-stepping down London's Oxford Street. It was always the chief's way not merely to predict and comment upon events, but actually to control them in the manner of a puppet master. The older he became, the more Northcliffe seemed like an eerie physical combination, very strong in the later photographs, of two famous European politicians, Churchill and Hitler. Baldwin, in words given him by his cousin, Rudyard Kipling, would denounce the press for exercising power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages. It's a good phrase, though of course it is itself journalistic, and it overlooks that this is what the politicians were doing too throughout the half century that we've been considering. Baldwin himself took no responsibility for the sufferings of the poor, brought in no New Deal for the English during the 1930s, and was pathetic in his failure to limit the irresponsible growth of Hitler's military might. What Northcliffe's power demonstrated to, among other people, his admirer Beaverbrook, Max Aitken, the Canadian, who was to be the second great newspaper power maniac of the age in Britain, was that in the 20th century power resided not as it had once done in things of substance, such as land. The 20th century returned to the Faustian days in which power consisted not even in knowledge, but in illusion, the ability to con the maximum number of people for the longest time, or time enough. The remark made by a Soviet official to Malcolm Muggeridge during one of the Stalinist show trials in Russia, that everything was true except for the facts, was a journalistic perception of brilliance. National Socialism depended on similar sleights of hand and lies, perpetrated not only through newspapers, but also through the brilliant films and newsreels of Leni Riefenstahl. Northcliffe's perception that power was perception, power was the control of other people's perceptions, reduced politicians to the role of puppets, in a crazy theatre where truth meant nothing. He spent the first year of the war in London, but he spent the last year of the First World War in the United States. They are mighty people, these Americans, and they will end the war, he telegraphed home to his beloved mother, to whom he spoke every day. He addressed huge crowds. 14,000 people in New York gave him a standing ovation. But the separation from the woman who meant most to him was an agony. And by the time he returned, he was anxious about the Prime Minister he believed himself to have created, Lloyd George. Lloyd George offered him a post in the government, Minister of Aviation, but Northcliffe, having believed himself to win the war, didn't much like the idea of this Prime Minister staying in power to dispense such trifles. I feel in the present circumstances I can do better work, he said, if I maintain my independence and am not gagged by a loyalty I do not feel towards the whole of your administration. But by now, 1919, his mind was beginning to become unhinged. Intuitively clever man that Northcliffe was, he could sense that the world had undergone a much bigger change than was apparent to the politicians. Throughout the 20th century, conservatives, both big and small c, have supposed or hoped that it would be possible to go back to a previous state of things after the cataclysm, such as a financial crash or a war. Northcliffe knew better than that. He feared that his beloved newspapers were going to be supplanted by electronic forms of journalism, the wireless. He saw the coming of electronic media. He sensed, as he toured the world, that the British Empire was undone, was becoming unravelled. And this 20 years or so before it was clear to most people. Thus, troubled in mind, he became more and more given to outbursts of rage and to the sending of abusive and megalomaniac telegrams to underlings, and what he would count as the same thing to government ministers. Eventually, the custom became so uncontrollable that those close to him, together with his medical advisers, disconnected the telephones without telling him that they'd done so. It was the equivalent, in any other man, of switching off a life support machine. He still continued to use the instrument, whispering down the line whenever he had a good scoop to pass on. To what he supposed was a sub on the Daily Mail, he was overheard by a nurse confiding, "I hear they say I'm going mad. Send down the best reporter for the story." One of his last barked instructions was, "Tell Mother she was the only one." And other late scoops, which he vouchsafed to his staff, included the intelligence that God was a homosexual. By this time, he'd retreated to the roof of his house, number 1 Carlton House Gardens in London. The doctors believed that the cooling breezes would soothe his troubled mind. The roof was too weak to support the revolving shelter in which he resided, and his neighbour, the Duke of Devonshire, gave permission for the roof of the adjoining house to be used instead. And there, raving and sad, the father of modern British journalism died lonely beneath the modern sky of a London summer. If the death of truth itself seemed heralded by the last grasping fantasies of Northcliffe, what of that other strand of European tradition, that of Christianity? Nietzsche had heralded the death of God before the 20th century began. And there were many who, while not going so far as that, would have echoed Lord Tennyson's belief that the church, at least, would fizzle out very soon after the Victorian era. The 20th century church had a revival which would have surprised many Victorian intellectuals. But it, too, like the world of politics, had entered a phase of its existence where the borderline between fantasy and reality was delicately trodden, and where serious matters could easily totter into farce. Consider the fate of a man who was very famous once upon a time in England, though I don't think his fame ever crossed the Atlantic, the rector of a small Norfolk village, Stewkey. On Trafalgar Day, 21st of October, 1932, an extraordinary scene was enacted in Norwich Cathedral in the east of England. At 11:45, the Bishop of Norwich, Dr. Bertram Pollock, the Chancellor of the Diocese, the Registrar, wearing a wig and a gown, the Dean and the Canons, the Archdeacon, and various other bewigged lawyers from London proceeded to the Beauchamp Chapel. Outside the building, they could hear a car screeching to a halt, followed by the cheers of a crowd. And before the proceedings began, they saw, hurrying into the cathedral and clutching a silk hat, which seemed much too large for him, the tiny figure of the Reverend Harold Davidson, M.A., accompanied by his sister and a female friend. The appointer called out, "Oyez, oyez, oyez, all persons cited and admonished to appear in this court and answer to your names as you shall be called. God save the King." The rector's name was called 3 times, and he answered, "Here." The bishop then proceeded with the melancholy ceremony of defrocking the rector, or depriving him of holy orders. He had entered the cathedral a priest. He left it a furious, yelling layman, calling out that he would make an appeal to the Archbishop of Canterbury. There was hardly an English newspaper between March and July of 1932 which did not contain daily references to the rector of Stewkey. This village, whose parish priest Davidson became aged 31 in the year 1906. For years, Mr. Davidson conducted the services at Stewkey each Sunday, and as Monday dawned, he would leave his wife and 5 children in the rectory, while he himself would catch the train from Wells next the sea to the capital, to London, where he would spend the remainder of the week making a nuisance of himself with adolescent girls. At Marble Arch, for example, he met Barbara Harris, aged 16. Surely she must be Miss X, and he would name a famous film star of the day. Barbara, in this case, was no innocent, but she enjoyed the chat-up line. At 2 a.m., not long afterwards, the rector called on her and found her sitting up in bed with her Indian lover, a policeman, who told the overexcited padre fascinating stories of temple prostitutes in his native land. When Harold Davidson was prosecuted and brought to Church House in Westminster to answer charges of conduct unbecoming a clerk in holy orders, he was forced to go through one of those humiliating cross-examinations which seemed designed for the sadistic amusement of lawyers and the enrichment of newspapers, but which are curiously difficult to see as advancements of civilization. When one of the girls, Rose Ellis, had given evidence, Roland Oliver, a lawyer for the prosecution, asked the rector, "Is it your view of decency to go to a flat and get this pretty girl to dress your naked body?" The rector replied, "You are making the most outrageous suggestion. I never said that." "Was the boil on the buttock of your body?" Silence. "Have you to think?" nagged the lawyer. "Yes," said the rector, "but I don't know what the buttock is." "You don't know?" "Honestly, I don't know." "Mr. Davidson, it is a phrase, honestly, I have never heard. But so far as I remember, it is a little below the waist." Davidson was more interested in the red lips and white teeth and cheeky smiles of the girls that he met than in what could be found below the waist. In the weeks of the trial, no evidence was ever produced that he had made love in the modern sense to any of the girls whom he flattered and pestered. He'd invited the girls down to the rectory for pyjama parties. He had approached so many girls in ABC tea shops and Lions corner houses that many such establishments had banned him. He was unsavoury, he was a little mad, but the savage processes brought against him were unable to yield the results they wanted. Even Rose Ellis, the most salacious of the witnesses, admitted under cross-examination that she had lied, having been bribed with port wine in a saloon bar by a private detective engaged on behalf of the Bishop of Norwich. The trial and defrocking of the rector had revealed the extent to which upright bourgeois morals were upheld more in the minds of leader writers in newspapers and Sunday school teachers than in the actual lives of young people living in British cities. The girls Davidson befriended, whom he claimed by turns that he wanted to rescue from the dangers of drink, prostitution, the stage, or the Roman Catholic Church, were those who in only a very few years would join the ATS, become land girls, wrens, factory workers, the pillars of England. In 1932, they were bored teenagers hanging around in cafes with easy morals and amused by the antics of funny little Harold, who sometimes wore a collar and tie and pretended to be a theatrical impresario and sometimes wore a clerical collar. Davidson's end was as dramatic as had been his vision of life. Unable to take his case to appeal, he raised money by performing stage reenactments of his trial. When one of the vindictive landladies who gave evidence at his trial pursued him in law for £45, which he was unable to pay, he spent 9 days in Liverpool jail. On his release, he rode through the streets of Liverpool with a young girl on either side of him, throwing flowers to a crowd of jubilant spectators. The church had arrayed itself in the garments of Caiaphas to condemn this mentally unstable man. In its brutality towards Davidson, there was some foreshadowing of the way it would treat the new king in 1936. By then, Davidson's fate as tragic buffoon, come early Christian martyr, was grotesquely sealed. He'd begun to appear during the summer months at the Skegness amusement park in the north east of England in a lion's cage. In July 1937, from a cage measuring 14 by 8 feet, Davidson addressed the crowds on the iniquities of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Norwich. Freddie, the lion who shared the cage while these denunciations were in progress, reared up on his haunches and began to maul the little man. It was appropriate that the human being who came to the rector's rescue was Freddie's tamer, Irene Violet Sumner, a 16-year-old girl. He never recovered consciousness, and when they took him from the cage, he was presumably drifting towards death, his spirit seeing Irene Violet leaning toothily towards her with the offer perhaps of a tea cake or help in getting a job, or simply with some flirtatious exclamation of astonishment at her supposed resemblance to Jean Harlow. As he died, he probably entered the Empyrean as Dante had done, thinking of girls, or like Goethe's Faust, whose last gasp is an affirmation of the eternal feminine leading us on. Das ewige Weibliche sieht uns hinan. Out of the millions of painful and unnecessary deaths which occurred between the death of Queen Victoria and the death of King George VI, why choose those two as illustrative of an era's colouring? Of course, I could have chosen others, and as I say, I'm going to mention a couple in a moment. But unlike any previous period of history, the 20th century was actually of its essence absurd. It had an ineluctable tendency towards farce. Chaplin, who wasn't always especially funny, tried to guy Hitler. Hitler, terrifying magician, failed genius, jumped-up corporal, however you regard him, was, among other things, a farcical figure. It's an amazing fact that the British radio comedians and variety artists during the Second World War could always get a laugh simply by mentioning Hitler. He was of his essence funny. The greatest artists of the time, Picasso, Pound, Joyce, saw that what might be regarded as culture, or Western culture, or the Christian tradition, had somehow or another been blown to bits in the last stages of the Victorian period. Industry, science, capitalism had done for them. If anything was to survive, all that could be done was to piece together the old shards. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish, as Eliot had asked? Writers and artists who tried to be serious in that period so often seem pitifully empty to us. Many of the best lyrics of the early 20th century and up to its middle were penned not by poets limping along in the great modernists' wake, but in popular songs. Noel Coward, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hammerstein will surely live when many of the poets anthologized in collections of 20th century verse have been forgotten. Somehow, soul had gone. Something had been sucked out. European humankind seemed to be playing an impossible game, not unlike the curses meted out to the unfortunate in fairy stories by the Brothers Grimm. Attempt one good thing, and two evils will follow. The ideal of national independence, for example, self-determination, which underpinned not merely the liberalism of President Wilson, but surely the decent instincts of everyone else, was what had inspired Princip to assassinate the Archduke in the first place in 1914. And in the carve-up which followed the carnage, the great powers gave hope to the Serbs, the Arabs, the Irish, the Jews, the Bosnians, to everyone more or less except the Germans, that they might enjoy national sovereignty, always with cataclysmic consequences and more slaughter. In a brilliant article of the 26th of January 2004, published in the British New Statesman, Robert Skrzydelsky pointed out that genocide, that distinctive, if not uniquely 20th century phenomenon, is the direct consequence of two high ideals of national independence and democracy. Under the old umbrellas of empire, people were not free. But once the Ottoman Empire had ceased to be a sprawling collection of different peoples with various religions and value systems and ethnic origins, what was to be the defining feature of the new modern nation of Turkey? Very, very quickly it became race, with dire consequence if you happen to be an Armenian. The massacre of tens, probably hundreds of thousands, possibly as many as 1 million Armenians, came about directly as a consequence of freedom from the old imperialist idea. Who remembers the Armenians? Hitler asked soberingly in his table talk in the early 1940s. In Russia, the massacres in the name of freedom were numerically far greater. The British were to discover at the end of the period in my book that by relinquishing an unjustifiable imperialist hold over India, they were threatening it with democracy. The Hindu majority could rejoice if given total control, but what of the Muslim minority? The massacres which followed and the inevitable partition of Pakistan and Bangladesh tell their own grisly tale. It remains true, as far as most historians are concerned, that the only villains in history are Germans, with possibly the Japanese thrown in for good measure. But I hope that anyone who is kind enough to read my book will understand why I consider such a view absurd. Things and actions, wrote the wise Bishop Butler in the 18th century, are what they are, and the consequences of them will be what they will be. Why then should we desire to be deceived? The answer to that, I think, is that deception is often more comforting than truth. It's easier to say that if everyone had democracy and national self-determination, we should all be more happy, rather than to read the story of what did happen in Russia, in Spain, in the Balkans, in Ireland, in the Middle East, where this creed, this belief that problems of peoples are best answered by politics, were put into practice. In the atmosphere which politics created and which capitalism with its ups and downs fed, topsy-turvydom and tragic absurdity became inevitable. Science itself, which replaced art or the imagination as the guiding principle of human aspiration, was turned to deadly use. Being itself, what is it? This rather basic question had been asked by the very young philosopher in Germany during the 1920s, late 1920s, Martin Heidegger, who realized that with all our pretended wisdom of over 2,000 years of philosophy and science, we'd forgotten to ask the basic question, what is being itself? His voice was only to be heard outside the narrow confines of academic philosophy in the period following the Second World War. And even now one suspects that most of the Swiftian debates taking place between, for example, creationists and Darwinians have failed to understand what he was saying. So the greatest discoveries about existence with which the first half of the 20th century came to terms were not metaphysical, they were scientific. Einstein, Planck, Bohr, Rutherford, these were the great changes of human perception during the 1901-1945 period. The period of biochemistry and the extraordinary developments of genetics belong to our own lifetimes. The first half of the 20th century was dominated by physics. Physicists know that physics is a particular branch of knowledge, but in this period, this topsy-turvy period, politicians, popularizers, poets, who only half grasped what the physicists were saying, mistook it for knowledge itself. It became indeed both the quantum physics developed by Einstein and Planck and the atomic physics pioneered by Rutherford and developed with such deadly effect in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the period prior to the summer of 1945, something akin to that forbidden knowledge which had fascinated wizards and magicians ever since the Middle Ages. The Victorians thought they'd seen off God. It was one of their saddest but most decisive achievements. Those who lived after the Victorians could make wonderful use of their engineering and scientific skills, and they could work out the conflicts between their ideals of economic liberalism and their political imperialisms. But they were bereft, gazing, as one of them famously said, like Titus on Jerusalem, on vacant seats and empty halls, a sanctuary with no presence to hallow it. I began with two deaths of considerable absurdity, and I'd like to end with two deaths which were very far from absurd. One was in a prison camp, the prison camp of Flossenburg, on the 9th of April, 1945, when Pastor Bonhoeffer was hanged for his involvement in the Stauffenberg plot to assassinate Hitler. Bonhoeffer's letters from prison remain among the most toweringly impressive documents of the period. He didn't come from an especially religious background. His father was a noted psychologist who had effectively lampooned Freud. Their musical, agnostic household was far from superstitious. Bonhoeffer was a large, well-dressed, cultivated, genial man. It's funny to think of him when he was a very young clergyman in London, ministering to the German congregation there, having lunches with Bishop Bell of Chichester at your namesake, the Athenaeum Club, that temple of Victorian agnosticism. The ghosts of Matthew Arnold or Huxley or Lyell or Herbert Spencer must have hovered in the gravy-laden air as the two men talked. Bonhoeffer studied in Berlin under the great Adolf Harnack, the historian of dogma, and he began as what was called in those days a liberal Protestant. He became a much more radical figure, embracing really the teachings of Bultmann, namely that the New Testament was a sort of mythology whose truth is authenticated not in waging pointless battles with science and not in asserting the historicity of events, but rather with a personal engagement, with a set of values with which the old pieties and traditions had been associated. A set of values which asserted, even in death, that love is stronger than hate, and that every man, woman and child, regardless of race or class, is of equal value. Very early on, Bonhoeffer saw that those who held to this creed in Germany, he asserted as much in 1932, the year before Hitler even came to power, would ultimately have to pay for it with their lives. And so he did. In the dawn of that April, only a few weeks before the end of the war, the prison doctor who saw him die was struck not only by his lovability, but by his extraordinary serenity in the face of death. It was a martyrdom, a witnessing, a standing out with tremendous simplicity against the evil, but also against the profound absurdity, not only of National Socialism, but of the conflicts which had been waged in politics and on the battlefield for the previous 45 years. Gandhi's death at the hands of an assassin seems to me to have some of the same wonderful luminosity. Over his funeral pyre, over Gandhi's funeral pyre, Nehru spoke the famous words, "The light which shone in this country was no ordinary light," and he was right. Inspired by reading Tolstoy and the Bhagavad Gita and the Gospels, Gandhi was, since his career began as a young lawyer in South Africa until the time of the assassination in Delhi on the 30th of January 1948, in the deepest sense, contra mundum. His dogged defiance of the British Empire was, on one level, the triumph of simple rationalism. He wasn't appealing to some spurious notion of democracy or racial purity or any of the other noxious mythologies which gripped human minds during his lifetime. He appealed quite simply, as his master Tolstoy had done, to the knowledge that inside each of us is a conscience telling us how to live. It needs no mumbo-jumbo, it needs no Nuremberg rally, it needs no cleverness to urge us towards peace and serenity. It could be said that Gandhi's campaigns for Indian independence, ending as they did in conflicts between Hindu and Muslim, which continue disastrously to this day, and the consequent savage resurgence of Muslim irrationalism, were no better than any of the other political campaigns of the 20th century. But the point is that Gandhi's were not really political campaigns. Bonhoeffer saw that institutional religion was very unlikely to last, but that what he called religionless Christianity would. Gandhi likewise saw that human individuality, what Quakers call the inner light, or the candle of the Lord, was ultimately indestructible, and that nation-states, dictatorships, empires, tyrants, parliaments can ultimately no more stop them than a paving stone can prevent grass from popping up in the spring. Gandhi's last word, Rama, the name of one of the incarnations of Vishnu, is not a political slogan. In one of the great novels of the age, which isn't much read nowadays, published in 1951 by the author John Cooper Powys, spent most of his productive years in the United States, but was a Welshman, Porreus, it's a recreation of the Dark Ages and the era of King Arthur. Merlin says this: "Nobody in the world, nobody beyond the world can be trusted with power. The golden age can never come again till governments and rulers and kings and emperors and priests and druids and gods and devils learn to unmake themselves and leave men and women to themselves." Well, fairly obviously, that golden age has not been reached today, and Merlin's words seem truer than ever. I've said enough, I think, to indicate why the rallying cry in Kingsley Amis's first novel, Thank God for the 20th Century, rings hollow to me, and why Merlin seems a surer guide. My motto would not be up with the 20th century, it would be done with the 20th century, and let's go back to the comparative benignity of the Dark Ages. Thank you very much. Well, if anybody wanted to ask for questions, of course.
I remember you, I believe I remember you correctly, you made one comment in German, which ended in banal. I'm so sorry, I just looked at it.
Oh, it's the last lines of Goethe's Faust, and it's how the eternal feminine leads us eternally onwards and upwards. It's when Faust is redeemed, when his girlfriend that he's treated pretty badly redeems him by leading him back up to heaven.
I have a question, Mr. Wilson. Can you share with us what led you to abandon an early thought of a career in the priesthood of the clergy? You are lost to the world as an orator.
It's a very kind question. I was asked what led me to abandon my youthful ambition to become a clergyman. I don't think it was fear that I would end up in a lion's cage. I think it was doubt, not doubting the Almighty so much as doubting my own capacity. I think it was simple doubt as to that. I just knew that I was personally unsuited to this role. Leave it at that.
The Fifth Amendment is available even to you. Would you care to speculate if there is a superpower in the year 2050, what country might it be, and how did it get there?
I've been kindly reminded that the Fifth Amendment is available even for me, but I've also been asked to speculate if there is a superpower in the year 2050, who it will be and how it will get there. Well, that, of course, is a difficult thing to do unless you provide me with the crystal ball. The reason I wrote this book, and the reason I called it with a boring title in a way, After the Victorians, was that it seemed so obvious after I'd finished a book called The Victorians that the story was unfinished. What was that story? Basically, it was the story of many, many things, of course, but it was the story of free trade. The Victorians, in England principally, invented the doctrine of economic liberalism. They had battles about it in the 1820s and 30s. By 1844, when they repealed basically any tariffs on the import of foreign foods, they had let loose the idea that we could all have a free-for-all. Now, what's just happened in South America during the last week shows that the United States is very much in the position that England was in 100 years ago. It was the leading free trade economy of the world, and it believes, as England did then and still does very largely, that free trade brings about more advantages than it brings disadvantages, because it brings wealth to the greater number and it brings a kind of freedom. Of course, it's no surprise that people want to smash your windows if you go around South America saying that, because it also brings other things. But of course, what threatened the English at various points during the 19th century threatens the United States now. When the Indians began to make cotton more cheaply than the British were able to do, and when Gandhi very successfully boycotted British cotton, or when in an earlier phase, during the Civil War in this country, the supply of cotton dried up in Lancashire, then the English were reduced to poverty. And I suppose what we do when we look around the globe now is we look to India and to China and realize that if you do believe in free market economics, it's inevitable that the country with the largest number of people who are prepared to work for the lowest wage are going to come out as some kind of an economic superpower. And therefore, I would answer your question that China will be the superpower. Simply in terms of numbers, and simply because they are in the position that the British were in 1840. They were prepared to make things with basically slave labour. And there's no competition against slave labour. What they will do with their power is another question, of course. Sinologists would have to tell us. Yes, sir.
In the first decade of the 20th century, three artists changed drastically their form of art. Picasso put aside perspective, Schoenberg put aside tonality, and James Joyce put aside the narrative, as we know it. Was that the dawn of the 20th century Middle Ages?
Well, it was a very good question. It was that three great figures of the 20th century, Picasso in art putting aside perspective, Schoenberg putting aside tonality, and Joyce putting aside straightforward narrative, changed 20th century art. And was this the dawn of the Middle Ages? I think it was certainly what those were doing, and Eliot and Pound in poetry in different ways were also doing, and Alban Berg, were reflecting something which I'm going to sound more Hegelian than perhaps I should do at this point, which was unquestionably something which had happened to European civilization. It had somehow or another reached the buffers. It is partly to do with a question of self-belief, I think. It's partly to do with the religious question which we are all aware of. And there was the phenomenon of modernism and religion, which was conveniently forgotten after the Second World War. So my answer to your question is yes. I think that, not that they're the heralding of the Middle Ages, but they are three of the great heralds and proclaimers of what had happened to human beings in the 20th century. And in the music of Schoenberg, in the paintings of Picasso, and certainly in the writings of the two poets I named, I think you discern something of what has happened to the human condition in the 20th century, which is still very, very difficult to understand. But they are the three who are likely to help us, I think.
I'm not quite sure where they want you to be next. I think you're going to be near your books. Is that?
Thank you very, very much. I'll just get the bag without forgetting.
Would you like me to take the bag and put it in the hall?